like to introduce Tim Maywald, who is an instructor for Blue Ridge PRISM. He is invaluable to us, one of our most respected experts, and we're so glad to have him here today. And really quick, joining us on the panel is William Hammerski, who's also one of our valued instructors, and our invasive management specialists, Jacob Edel and Natalie Walker, who were presenting to you yesterday, and our executive director, Lauren Taylor. So you've got a really good group of people who are there to answer your questions in the Q&A. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Tim.
Okay. Guess you have to. Here we go. Okay. As a part of, well, we're starting this year with a seasonal series of invasive plant identification and treatment sessions we'll be holding seasonally. Yesterday, we introduced people to several woody invasives, some grasses, and an aquatic species that are both relatively easy to identify in the fall, and they're good targets for fall treatment. In December, we'll do the same thing for good winter target invasives, as we will again in the spring and again in the summer. So there may be a specific tree or a shrub or a vine that's of particular interest to you that we didn't address in identification yesterday, but most of the techniques for woody invasives that we discussed today will work for them. This also applies for grasses. On the other hand, most herbaceous invasives are not ideal targets at this time of year because they've mostly gone to seed, and treating them is either too late or will contribute to spreading the seed. So we'll be addressing them at other times of year as part of this seasonal series. And another thing I'd like to clarify before we get started is while I will be addressing both physical and chemical treatment of invasive plants, my discussion of chemical treatment, that is herbicides, will be pretty general. I won't be getting into detail on brands and active ingredients and concentrations for specific treatment techniques today. PRISM will be delivering that kind of detail in a session that we're developing now, and we'll be delivering sometime next year that we're going to call Demystifying Herbicide Control of Invasive Plants. However, I will show you a quick reference chart that's been developed on chemical treatment of invasive plants by the Virginia Department of Forestry, and show you where you can get a copy of it. So let's get going. So what I'm going to do today is talk about treatment of plants by category. We'll look at woody plants because the treatment techniques that we use with them are pretty similar, whether it's a tree, a shrub, or a vine. It's just an issue of size, pretty much. Grasses are a little different. I'll be talking about how to deal with grasses, and we have one aquatic, and I'll talk about some aquatic techniques. So for the structure of the discussion, I'm going to start with physical techniques, things that don't involve using chemicals, herbicides. Then I'll talk about chemical treatment, and then I'll talk about combination treatment techniques where you do something physical to the plant, basically to open up its vascular system, and then you apply an herbicide into it. So physical techniques, chemical only, and then combination techniques. Starting with physical, even as an herbicide user, myself and other herbicide users, if we can hand pull a plant, we're not going to use herbicide on it. You don't have to use herbicide, you don't use it. So if plants are small at the seedling stage, whether it's eventually going to become a 60-foot tree or a shrub or a vine, when they're really small, if the soil conditions are right, we hand pull it. If it won't come out, but it's still pretty small, we can use a technique called grubbing, or we can dig it out, or we can use tools that are called extractors that I'll show you shortly. Another basic physical technique is cutting. And there's all sorts of tools you can be used to cut, which are basically based on the size of the stem that you're cutting of the woody plant. Then again, when they're small, there's some mowing that you can do. You can use a bush hog, for instance. And for somewhat larger plants, maybe up to 4 or 5 inches or so, you can use a a device called a forestry mulcher, which we'll take a look at. And then we can always, when they're small, get out our goats and use the grazing approach. And if you happen to have plants in your garden, for instance, in your yard, which you are just learning now are invasive, and you really can't give them up because you really like them, like your burning bush or your nandina, and you don't want to get rid of it and replace it with something native, there are containment uh, approaches, techniques that we can use, and we'll look at those. So again, whether you're an herbicide user or not, there are occasions when you cannot use herbicides at a specific locale. State law right now, actually it was passed last year, says that in public spaces anywhere in the state of Virginia, you do not need to be a licensed herbicide applicator in order to apply herbicides in public spaces. Now that's true as long as there aren't more restrictive regulations at the local level. For instance, I live near Charlottesville, and although state laws say I can apply herbicides in public parks in Charlottesville regulations say, no, I can't. I have to be licensed. So there are cases where you simply can't use herbicide because you're not allowed to. There are other situations where you may choose not to use herbicide. You don't want to use herbicides. You think they're not a good technique to be using. Fine, then you need to know what the physical techniques are. But as I mentioned before, when you can control your invasive plants without using herbicide, we typically choose to do that. This really tends to work best when you have smaller plants where you can get them out of the ground with their entire root system, because then they're not going to grow back. Okay, so let's look at probably the most common one, which is hand pulling, which you use for seedlings, small plants. Right here, I'm pulling, this is autumn olive. So it's practical for small invasions. If you've got 5 acres of Japanese stiltgrass, this isn't going to work unless you get an army. But the good thing about it is if you can get it out of the ground complete with its entire root system or most of it, it won't grow back. So that's great. You don't have to come back and do it over again. It's only going to be effective when the soil is moist, after a good rainfall or after snow. Right now here in Piedmont, Virginia, we're in basically a drought. We have not had much rain in the last couple of months. Hand pulling just isn't working. But hopefully we'll get some rain sometime. So for the way to go about it is I typically grab a hold of it the way you see here, and I don't generally just jerk it. I kind of wiggle it around a little bit, and you'll be able to tell pretty quickly after doing this a little bit, if you haven't done it before, whether it's going to give or not, whether you're going to be able to get it out of the ground, or whether it's going to break off right at ground level. So practice a little bit, and you need to be paying close attention to this the first time that you're hand pulling on a given day that you're out, in order to test the level of soil moisture and whether or not it's going to give. So if you do get it out of the ground, there's one thing that you need to keep in mind, is that when you pull it out of the ground, as you can see here, I've pulled out some invasive plants, and that disturbs the soil. And soil disturbance is a key factor in encouraging seeds that are in the seed bed in the ground to sprout. So to discourage that, you want to tamp down the disturbed soil and maybe kick over some of the debris that's on the forest floor. Try to cover it up. And that's going to discourage the disturbed soil from being a causative agent for new germination of seeds. So don't forget to do that. Now, if you can't hand pull and you want to stay strictly with your physical techniques, the next step up the ladder is to get a little help in getting the roots out of the ground. And you can do that through grubbing. You can see here, this is a hand mattock. You plunk it into the ground on the far side of the root ball. You pull on the plant stem gently and pry it up out of the ground. Or you can do digging with a garden spade or with a hori-hori knife. And for even up to maybe an inch and a half size stems of your woody plants, your shrubs in particular, young um, saplings of invasive trees or vines, you can use a tool called an extractor, which has a clamp on it that clamps around the base of the stem right at ground level. And then you have all of this length of it to give you extra leverage to be able to pull it out, ideally completely with its complete root system. And again, all of these techniques are going to disturb the soil, so you want to tamp down that disturbance as much as you can, cover it with forest debris, try to discourage germination of seeds. As the size of your woody stems becomes too big for hand pulling or grubbing or extraction, then you're into cutting. And typically, what we use is pruning tools, a straight saw, folding saw, hand cutter, loppers to be a little extra reach. That extra reach is very useful if you're dealing with a prickly plant like a barberry shrub, because you don't want to mess with the prickers on those things. And the lopper can allow you to make your cut from a distance. And as they get larger, you can graduate upward from the saw where I'm cutting. This is autumn olive to this tool. It's called a brush cutter. And what it is a weed whacker, a string trimmer, where we've taken off the string device from the bottom of it and put on a saw blade. Now, this is a very dangerous tool. You have to be very careful about using it. You have to be using the proper personal protective equipment, but it's a very effective tool for your smaller woody stems, maybe 3.5 inches and down. And then, of course, when you get to the big stuff, like this is a big, mature autumn olive, and you have to use a chainsaw for that kind of thing. So choose your tool based on stem size. Then when we get into some of our grasses, which we might find out in meadow situations, this is a bush hog, and it can take down everything up to, I think it'll cut stuff that's about 3/4 of an inch. And to take down bigger stuff where uh, with a lot of shrubs, invasive shrubs, like whether it's autumn olive or amber honeysuckle or any of the ones that we talked about yesterday, this device is called a forestry mulcher, and it has a drum across the front of it, which has big teeth on it, and it can chew up stems up to maybe 4 inches or so, and you can just grind through a concentrated area of invasive shrubs and even small saplings, and all it leaves on the forest floor is mulch. And the operators for these vehicles are really good at what they do. They will avoid, you can go out ahead of time and you can mark things that you want left. They know how to differentiate between invasive and native plants. They're not going to damage trees. They can work around them. They can work on fairly steep slopes. So it's a really useful tool to use where you have extensive incursion of invasives, woody invasives. We're trying to do it by hand, with a handsaw. You'd need an army to do it. So these are some of the techniques that you can be using that do not require herbicide. And then, of course, there's grazing. This hillside, this is before, this is after, and they've pretty much denuded it, and they're all fat and happy, literally. There are some issues you have to pay attention to here, and that the goats are not going to differentiate between natives and non-natives, so they're going to eat some good stuff along with the bad stuff. So you really want to use them where most of the native plants have already been outcompeted by invasives. Second thing is you need to have an experienced, a goat herd who's experienced in vegetation management. And some of these techniques cost you some money. This is not inexpensive to rent a herd for a couple of weeks. And the last thing I'll mention on purely physical techniques is the concept of containment. Let's first talk about your neighbors decide they want to have a little privacy. So they plant bamboo, running bamboo like this, and you don't want it on your property. You can put in what's called a bamboo shield. It's pretty thin stuff, maybe 3 millimeter or so, but the tips of the rhizomes of bamboo are tiny. It will stop them. You dig your ditch, you put it in, you backfill it, and your neighbor's bamboo isn't going to come onto your property. So it's not treating the bamboo itself, it's simply keeping it from getting to where you don't want it. A similar technique you can use with a lot of your bedded invasives, uh, English ivy, winter creeper, vinca. Don't let it get near something where it can grow vertically, because then it can convert to its mature stage and start to produce seed. When it's on the ground, it can only spread by creeping, and you can contain that. Once it gets up and into the sun and starts to produce seed, you've lost control of it. So this is another containment technique. And the last one would be, um, this again relates, I guess, to people who really like their burning bush or their nandina or whatever their invasive shrub is. That's appearance-wise, it's just very attractive. Although there are native ones that have similar attractive characteristics. What you want to do is, at least, if you're not going to get rid of it, snip off the fruit. And in this photo that I took, this is just kind of as an example. You typically don't want to wait until the fruit is ripe before you do this. You want to do it while it's still green, before it's become attractive to birds and they've started to spread it on you. So these are all containment techniques you can use. There's no herbicide involved. And it can kind of keep things under control. It's not perfect, but it's an option. And speaking of options, if you take a look at the URL here, you're going to get a copy of this video, and you'll see URLs under some of these to tell you where you can find these documents. This is a document that was put out by the state of California, but despite the fact that it's from California, there are more techniques here than I've been able to talk about in the limited time that we have available that are purely physical techniques that can be applied here in the eastern United States. So you might want to take a look at this and get some more ideas for techniques that you can use, either where you're not allowed to use herbicides or where you choose not to use herbicides. Okay, which brings us to we're still talking about trees, shrubs, and vines, the woody ones, before we get into the grasses and the aquatics. But now we're going to look at chemical assisted techniques, ones that use herbicide. And for a purely herbicide approach, there are two techniques. The first is called basal bark, where you spray the bark of the tree, the lower portion of the bark, from ground level up to about 18 inches or so, with a herbicide that's in an oil. And the oil helps the herbicide to penetrate through the thin bark. It's only useful for small trees, small shrubs, under 6 inches or so, and allows the herbicide to get into the vascular system, the plant's counterpart to our veins and arteries, and move down to the roots and kill the roots, and then it won't grow back. So that's the whole thing about herbicides is, with your physical techniques, unless you get all the roots out, if you're just cutting or something like that, it's going to grow back. If you use herbicide, it's once and done. It's over with. So basal bark is one technique. The other is called foliar spray, where you spray the foliage, you spray the leaves. So spray the bark or spray the leaves. We'll look at those techniques in a moment. And then we'll look at combination techniques where we do something physical to the plant to open up its system to allow us to apply an herbicide into the stem, and the herbicide can move down to the roots and kill it. So you're, again, once and done. So the first of these techniques is called cut stump. Basically, you cut the plant off, usually at ground level, and then you apply a small amount of herbicide around the periphery of the stump. That's where the vascular tissue resides. Right around the outer edges is the only active vascular tissue. You don't have to put herbicide on the whole thing, just the outer edge. And the second technique is called either hack and squirt or scrape and squirt. And these are techniques where you create a cut into the stem and then apply the herbicide into the opening that you've created so they can get into the vascular system, move down to the roots, and kill the roots. So it's once and done. You don't have to deal with it ever again. So why do people use herbicides? Again, it's this once and done thing is part of it. Here we have a photo of I think this was, yeah, it's autumn olive. So this was cut without the application of herbicide. And you can see what's happened is stem cutting stimulates stem sprouting. These are all new growth sprouts because you've got a viable root system. It's going to continue to push new growth up. So if you used an herbicide, if you'd made this cut and then put a little herbicide around the edges, it wouldn't regrow. That's one of the shortcomings of not using herbicide is you're going to have to come back to this plant that you've cut once, and you're going to have to cut the regrowth. And next growing season, you'll have to do it again, and the next, and the next. It's usually 4, 5, maybe even 6 years of continual cutting of the regrowth until you've exhausted the stored energy in the roots and it won't grow back again. So you're way ahead of the game by cutting it and getting rid of it because it's not going to produce any more seed. But it does mean that you've created a long-term need to return and recut until you've exhausted the stored energy, and then it won't grow back. A second reason why herbicides are used is if you cut a plant, a woody plant, and don't apply herbicide, for some of them, not only will you get stem sprouting like you see in this photo, but you'll get root sprouts. This tree right here is a tree of heaven. It was cut, no herbicide was used, and here you're seeing from its root system all of these new root sprouts. And we're just seeing a small section of it. You know, the root sprouts are coming up all around the tree for 3 times the width of the tree because that's how big the root system is. So you got rid of one tree and you got 50 back. And you got to come back and cut these again repeatedly year after year until you've exhausted all the stored energy in the roots and they won't regrow. This is true for Chinaberry, which we talked about yesterday, Tree of Heaven, a number of the other trees. Not only do you get stem sprouting, you get root sprouting. And then another reason why herbicide is used is in situations like this, where you have, you know, a couple of acres or a few acres of invasives or dense invasives that are simply, there's too much there for you to be able to take on using strictly physical techniques. You need an army. Okay, so, whoops. Backing up here, excuse me. All right, so when you use herbicide, if you use herbicide, the label is the most important piece of information for you. It's the law. It lays out what the requirements are for its use. And the label tells you, I don't have a product name up here because I don't want you to think we're encouraging you to purchase any particular product. But this is a typical one. It will have the product name, then it'll have the active ingredients. And you can see here it's 22% active ingredient. The rest of it is what are called adjuvants. There are other liquids that the herbicide typically is in powder form and placed into a liquid. So there's material in the liquid to keep it in liquid form. There's usually what are called surfactants. Surfactants are surface active agents. And what they do is their job is to break down the cell layer in leaves to allow the herbicide to better penetrate into the vascular system of the plant and get down to the roots. And sometimes you'll have a coloring agent. There are various things that are in the liquid in addition to the active ingredient. The labels, this is a label. You kind of take it off the bottle, and it's like a book. It's really, there's an awful lot here, and the font is tiny. So down here at the bottom of the page, I've shown where you can go to an EPA site where you can get just a regular version of the document, and you can print it in whatever font size you like. So it's a lot easier to read because there's a lot to read. It has information on protecting pollinators, which is pretty straightforward. Like when it's flowering, don't spray. Treat it before it flowers and attracts pollinators. Treat it after it flowers when the pollinators aren't around. It gives specific directions for use in a lot of different circumstances. Are you applying it in meadows? Are you applying it to leaves? Are you applying it to woody stems? But there's just 20 or 30 different circumstances, which are all detailed, where it tells you, here's what your mix needs to be. Here's what the concentration needs to be. It talks about applicators. What applicator are you using? And how do you use it with that applicator? So all the details are in the label. Okay. Important. When I look at this photograph, it just gives me the heebie-jeebies. This gentleman is properly set up with PPE. He has eye protection. He has long sleeves. He happens to be wearing flesh-colored gloves, but he is wearing nitrile gloves. If you're going to get herbicide anywhere on you, if you're applying it, you're going to get it on your hands or your feet. And he's wearing rubber boots that come right up to his knees and long pants. He's also working along a roadside, so you notice that he has a safety vest on, a high visibility vest. But when you look over here, I mean, there's the glasses, but they're not on. Short sleeves, short pants, no gloves. Just freaks me out. Don't do that. Okay, so I mentioned before that for your purely herbicide approach, chemical approach, where you're just applying herbicide, you're not doing anything physical to the plant, there are two techniques. The first is foliar spray, and you can see this gentleman is applying herbicide to the leaves of this invasive plant. And here you can see that this gentleman is applying herbicide to the bark of this small tree. And he's spraying it from about ground level up to about 18 inches. So this is foliar application, spraying the foliage. This is basal bark application, spraying the bark. So let's go into a little more detail on these two techniques. For foliar application, the first thing is you want to be thinking about what is your target. This happens to be a vine of an invasive plant called Akebia, five-leaf Akebia. And in this case, the leaves are fairly sparse. This is not a great target for applying herbicide by spray because there's too much open space here, and the spray could pass through and hit something on the ground that you don't want it to hit. This is a good target. This is ground here. That's the ground cover is, this is English ivy, I believe. And it has outcompeted everything except there's like one bush over here, and it's climbing all these trees. This is a good target. Okay, you don't have to worry about hitting native plants because there aren't any. They've all been outcompeted. A second thing about herbicide use for foliar application is that the concentration of herbicide is very, very, very small. For some plants, it's like 1%. So 99% water, 1% active ingredient. And again, I mentioned, I'll be showing you at the end a chart that shows you if you're using herbicide, which herbicide to use for which plant and at what concentration. But for foliar application, you're always using a very, very, very dilute version. You're not putting much herbicide into the environment. The technique is to cover all of your target leaf, but don't put any more on it than that. You know, if it starts to drip off, you're putting on too much. A little bit of practice and you'll get the hang of it pretty quick. You may recall in this photo, you'll notice that he's spraying downward. Okay, you always want to be spraying downward. So that means the maximum height of the plant that your target plant is probably not going to be over about 5 feet. So this is really good for your invasive shrubs, your invasive ground covers, and your young plants, saplings and seedlings, as long as they're low enough for you to be spraying down. Once you start to spray up, you again can lose control of your herbicide spray, and it can be going places you don't want it to go. So just a basic technique is spray down. Excuse me. So let's look at basil bark, where we're spraying the bark. It's not suitable for big mature trees because by the time they get big, their bark has gotten to be so thick that the herbicide in the oil mix can't get through the bark. So you only use it for stems of small trees, shrubs. You can use it even for some large vines that are under 6 to 8 inches in diameter. Most of the herbicides we've been talking about, like most of your foliar ones, are mixed in water. When you're doing basil bark, your herbicide is mixed in what's called basil oil, and that oil helps to it helps the herbicide to penetrate through the bark, move through the vascular system, and get to the roots. The bark needs to be thin, so that's why you're kind of limited in the size you can do it for, the size stem that you use it for. And it needs to be dry. So this is not something you want to use after it's been raining for a few days. You want to let the bark dry out. Because if the bark is already full of water, it's not going to be able to hold the liquid herbicide. And again, you're going to be spraying around the entire trunk, starting at ground level and coming up to about 18 inches. And again, this is a fairly dilute version of the herbicide, so you're not putting a ton of herbicide into the environment. Okay, so we've looked at foliar, spraying the foliage, basil bark, spraying the bark, just using herbicide. Now we're going to look at using herbicide in combination with some physical activity, typically cutting. These techniques generally are referred to as cut stem, where you're going to cut into the stem, creating an opening into the vascular system, and then apply the herbicide into that opening. In some cases, you can cut the entire plant off down at ground level, plant falls over, you apply the herbicide down at the base. That's called a cut stump. In other cases, you cut into it, apply the herbicide into the cut. So that's hack and squirt or scrape and squirt, and we'll look at those two techniques. Starting with cut stump. So it can be used for any size trunk, stem. Here it's being applied to a very small stem of, this is barberry, you can see it's yellow. And the applicator is what's called a dauber. And this is the kind of herbicide applicator that's often used by novices, by people who are just starting to use herbicide. And the reason is you can take this container, hold it over your hand and shake it and nothing will come out. It's only going to issue herbicide if you press it to a surface. So you have 100% control over where that herbicide's going. It's only going where you touch. When you touch it to the surface, it releases a valve on the inside that allows the herbicide to come out. And it doesn't flow out. This has a tip which just becomes moistened by it. So very little herbicide's coming out, and you just kind of tap it around the outer edge of your cut stem. So a second kind of applicator you can use is a drip bottle. This is a drip bottle. It has a little pop-up nozzle on it, and you just drip a few drops. Again, we're only applying it around the outer edge because that's where the vascular system is, the vascular tubes. And then there's a spray bottle where you can spray a small amount of herbicide around the edges. You're going to be using whatever tool is appropriate for the size of the stem that you're cutting, whether it's a hand pruner, a lopper, hand saw, brush cutter, chainsaw, whatever. And as I mentioned, we only apply the herbicide on the outer edges. You don't need to cover your entire cut stem like this. And if you look closely here, you'll see kind of a lighter color right around the edge. You can see it over here as well, and a little bit of it here. What you're seeing there is that's where the vascular tissue is, nowhere else. This is where the active vascular tissue is that can move the herbicide downward, and that's what the plant uses to move water and nutrients upward. There's no active vascular tissue in the center here. Those are all clogged former tubes, no longer useful for moving anything up or down. So you only have to put the herbicide right on the outer edge, which means you're not using very much at all. Okay, so that was cut stump. This is hack and squirt. And hack and squirt is a very effective technique for larger stems, up from, maybe 2 inches or so, up to the largest tree, the largest invasive tree you'll ever find. This is typically the technique that's used. You don't have to cut the tree down. You simply hack into it and apply your herbicide into the hack. The hacking process opens up the vascular tissue, and you spray or drip in a little bit of herbicide, moves through the vascular system, gravity takes it downward, kills the roots, once and done. So it's important to pay attention to what angle you're hitting it at. You typically use a hatchet for this. Some people use a machete, but you want to hit it at about a 45-degree angle. If you think of the letter L, trying to make an L, halfway. Okay, that's 45 degrees. The reason you use this angle is that when you put the herbicide in, it's formed a little bit of a pocket that holds the herbicide and keeps it from dripping down. If you cut flat, it's just going to drip out. And you don't want to cut too narrow a hack because you can lose control of your hatchet. So you want to keep it out here at about 45 degrees. And we recommend that you take the tip of your spray bottle. Usually a spray bottle is used for applying herbicides when you use hack and squirt. Stick the tip right into the hack like this. Don't hold it back 6 inches and spray, because you'll be spraying it all over the bark. And this is water-based herbicide. It's not going to get through the bark. You want to get your herbicide into the hack. Now, how you place the hacks is very important. If you were to hack all the way around the tree continuously, that's called girdling, you would have severed all of the vascular tissue for the plant. And for a number of plants, particularly China berry, tree of heaven, and a few others, if you sever all of that vascular tissue, the tree can no longer move water and nutrients upward. And it goes into a survival mode. When that happens, it says, hey, whatever's up there, it isn't working anymore. I need to start popping up root sprouts. And that's when you get all the root sprouting, which you want to avoid. So what we do is we fool the tree, okay? We fool the stem, whether it's a tree or a big shrub stem or a big vine stem, by leaving some space in between the hacks. We leave viable vascular tissue. We're not cutting here. So you hack, leave space, hack, leave space, hack, leave space. That leaves a lot of viable vascular tissue. The plant doesn't realize that it's dead, but it's going to be pretty soon when the herbicide takes effect. So you have to kind of fool it. If you have a really large stem, if you're doing a mature sized tree, one thing to keep in mind is that all woody plants try to seal wounds, and they try to do it very quickly. So instead of doing your hack space, hack space, hack space all the way around the tree, and then coming back and applying the herbicide into each one, some of those could have sealed by the time you come around and start doing it. So do just 3 or 4 hacks at a time, apply your herbicide to those hacks, do some more hacks, apply the herbicide to those hacks, and then apply the rest. Kind of go around in sequence so that the hacks that you make don't seal. You want to make sure that the herbicide is able to be absorbed and move downward into the roots. So that's hack and squirt for big stems. And you can do it for trees. This is a English ivy vine. You can do it for vines. This is a privet. You can see I hacked it here, hacked it here, hacked it here. You can do it for large shrubs. So it's a very versatile technique for larger woody stems. Now, when you get to more narrow, thinner woody stems, you don't want to be hacking into them at a 45-degree angle because you could cut through and get into the tree. So when you're doing vines, like this is English ivy, the same would hold true for winter creeper. Any vine that's attached to the tree, either by these root-like holdfasts or by twining, using friction to hold it to the tree. If they're too narrow to hack into, you can use this technique, which is called scrape and squirt, where you're holding your hatchet, your cutting device, whichever one you're using, almost straight up and down, and you're just gently scraping off the outer bark and exposing the vascular tissue. And then you can daub on or spray on your herbicide to that opening. It now has access to the vascular system, goes down to the roots, and kills the roots with no possibility of damaging the tree because you're not going to cut through because you're cutting almost straight down. So this is scrape and squirt. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about vines. Yesterday, when we went through the identification section, we talked about bittersweet and boursoneberry. And this is bittersweet. And bittersweet can be found in 2 forms. Basically, it's a twining vine. You can see it twining around this tree. These vines are hanging loose. What's going on with them is they're twining higher up. So they're attached higher up and they can hang down loosely. So sometimes you'll see it twining, sometimes you'll see it hanging loosely. And you have a slightly different technique depending on which you see, and we'll look at those in a minute. And this is boursoneberry. And somewhere under here, here, and here, there's something growing, and it's growing over them. So there's good stuff underneath there. We're going to talk about here, thick vines. Here we're going to talk about thinner vines and the technique you use for those. So let's look at those. We'll start with twining vines, using bittersweet as an example. Bittersweet does twining, wisteria twines, Japanese honeysuckle twines. So there are a number of twining vines, and the technique for dealing with them is the same, regardless of what the vine is. You're going to take a cut and take a piece out so that the upper portion is no longer connected to the bottom portion. So the upper portion is dead. It's no longer getting water and nutrients. It's going to dry out. It's going to lose all its liquid weight, which is about 80% of its weight, which is relieving the tree of a lot of top weight and lessening the likelihood of it being blown down in a windstorm or ice or snowstorm. The lower portion, if you're not an herbicide user, you're done. You've made your cut here, you made your cut here, you took your piece out, move on. If you're an herbicide user, you can see here, right on the outer edge, we've applied a little bit of herbicide, okay? So this is like cut stump approach. Okay, here's your hanging vine, whether it's bittersweet or other ones which will hang like that. And you're going to make 2 cuts. Cut it down at ground level. If you're not applying herbicide, you're done. You've cut it down at ground level. The upper portion is no longer connected to the root portion. The upper portion is going to dry out and die. The lower portion is still viable. It's going to pop up sprouts, but that's where you would be using herbicide. And here's, if you're an herbicide user, you would drip on or daub on or spray on a little bit of herbicide around the edges. But then you're going to make a second cut that's going to be higher up around maybe shoulder level, some comfortable level, so that you no longer have a hanging vine connected from up in the tree down to the ground, because new growth will use that vine and wrap around it as a way to get up into the tree. So you don't want to give them that opportunity. So cut it down to ground level and then cut it again up shoulder, head level. And it does two things. First, it keeps it from being a way for new growth to get into the tree. But the other thing is it makes it really easy to see from a distance that it's been cut. So that's what you do with hanging vines. We looked at twining vines. We looked at attached vines for using the scraping approach. Boursomeberry. Now, the vines that we're looking at here are very thin. They may be a 1/4 inch around. At the most, maybe they're going to be a 1/2 or 3/4 of an inch around. They're very thin. If it's gotten to be a lot higher than that, there will be mixed in or along the trunk of the tree, there will be some bigger vines. But usually it's very thin. So what do you do when you have really thin vines? If there's not a lot of it, you would be using, you could be using a hand cutter or loppers. But if there's a lot of it like there is here, what we usually use is a battery operated or gas operated hedge trimmer or a manual hedge trimmer. And we just cut it right along the bottom here. All the upper part's going to die off, dry out, die, fall off. You don't have to pull it. You never want to pull vines off trees because you could pull a branch down on you. You could be breaking branches, which, you know, we're trying to protect these trees. The whole reason why we're trying to get vines off trees is to protect our canopy trees. We're getting to have fewer and fewer of them. They're really valuable. You know, it takes decades for them to grow. So we want to protect them. Now, what you could do here, you could cut it at this time of year. It's very easy to identify boursomeberry at this time of year because it's fruiting and its fruit is readily identifiable and easy to differentiate from native wild grape. But you could also wait until winter when it's lost its leaves and you can see what's underneath it. Before I would start cutting into this at this time of year when it's leafed out like this, I would be kind of pulling it apart a little bit to see there's something supporting it. It looks like there's a shrub here and trees here and here. And I don't want to cut into them. So I would want to be finding out what's underneath it before I start cutting. Okay. So much for the woody plants. We've looked at a whole range of physical only techniques and chemically assisted techniques for dealing with your woody stems. The only difference from the standpoint of treatment between vines, shrubs, and trees is size. You know, hand pulling when they're really small, and other physical techniques when they're really small. Cut stump, hack and squirt when they're really big. Doesn't matter which species of shrub or vine or tree it is, the techniques are pretty much the same. So let's look at grasses quickly. All right, so silvergrass, fountain grass, Ravina grass. Those are the ones we looked at yesterday. They're good fall targets. They're very easy to spot in the fall because they're big. For purely physical treatment for grasses, one is cutting. Okay, so you can see that this person has cut a big cluster of it here and is in the process of cutting a second cluster. What you want to do if you're going to use the cutting technique is don't wait until it gets this big. You want to start cutting it as soon as it's, you know, tall enough to start to cut, and just cut it all during the growing season because it's going to continue to try to grow because its roots are still viable unless you've applied herbicide. So just cut it and cut it, cut it and cut it. And unfortunately, it's going to take you years of cutting before you've exhausted all the stored energy in the roots of a grass like this. But eventually you can. So if you're not an herbicide user, you're going to be cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting for a long time. Another option for you is digging. And what I'm showing you here, this is the root system from Chinese silvergrass. And the reason I'm showing it to you is that you can see it's really dense and complex. And if you dig it out, you'll get most of it, but you won't get it all. Okay, I mean, you can't get it all because any small fragment of this can cause it to start to grow again. Okay, we can't do the impossible. You'll get most of it. So you want to keep an eye on that spot where you took it out because you're going to see some new sprouts coming up. Dig them up. And you just stay on top of that. As you see new sprouts coming up, dig them up if you want to use a digging approach. And this isn't going to take you as long as cutting is. It will probably take you 3 or 4 seasons before you will have gotten all of the remnants out of the ground and you won't see it regrowing. So mowing and cutting is going to take a long time. Digging's faster. These are non-herbicidal approaches. If you're an herbicide user, again, you treat it once and you're done. And typically you would be using the foliar spray approach. You'd be spraying the leaves of the grass. And fall's a good time to do it. There is some variation in time of year and which herbicide to use and what concentrations. They can vary by season. And we don't have time to go into that. But I will show you in a minute a chart that'll help you with some of that. But let me touch on aquatics quickly. We talked about two-horn trappa yesterday. This is one where hand pulling works all the time because it's rooted in it underneath water. So it's always wet. It's always easy to hand pull. It just depends on how much there is. Here you see, folks, this is how it's typically done. You have people in a kayak, and then they'll have like a rowboat with them, and they're hand pulling it, and they're dumping it into the rowboat, and they take the what they've pulled, take it up on the land, put it on a tarp, let it dry out. And once it's dried out, it's no longer able to sprout again. Now, if you have an awful lot of it, I'm sure many of you have one of these in your garage. This is called an aquatic weed harvester. Basically, you can hire somebody to do this. If you got a whole lake full of it, this is what you're going to be using. And there is the option of using herbicide, but you're not going to do it most likely. I'm not going to do it. You need to have a certified aquatic applicator use herbicides in these types of situations. So hand pull it, use the harvester, have someone professional use herbicide. The thing to keep in mind if you're hand pulling this stuff is that it's called two-horn trappa because it has 2 very sharp horns on it. And you need to be careful. They're sharp enough to go through certainly your gloves, your boots. If you have a really, if you have like a small farm pond, you can just put your waders on and walk in and hand pull the stuff. Okay. Once you get into bigger concentrations of it, you have to use these other approaches I just mentioned. But if you're hand pulling it, you want to be careful not to get nailed by those horns. If you're seeing it for the first time on your property, please report it. And here's where you would report it. You want to report it to EdMaps because we're trying to track the spread of this plant because it's spreading really fast. Okay, so this is the chart that I've been referring to that's been issued by the Virginia Department of Forestry. And it lists your invasive plants by group, grasses, your herbaceous plants, your vines, your shrubs and your trees. And it talks about what's the best time of year to go after them, what's the best techniques to use, physical only, chemical assisted, where it says herbicides are appropriate for use, it will tell you what herbicide at what concentration, and then it'll have some notes or things that you need to be paying attention to. So this document is available on our website here. So when you get your copy of this, go check that out. Very useful tool. And keep in mind that we in PRISM will be having a session sometime next year that specifically deals with trying to make this simpler. What herbicide to use, what concentration for what plant. Okay, sanitation and disposal. Boy, if you're cutting stuff in the fall, you want to make sure that the fruits, you're bagging them and putting them in your garbage. This document will give you a lot of assistance in deciding which plants you need to be paying attention to sanitation for and how. And this is not last but least, this is last but really important. I'm telling you this last to protect you. Work safely. Use personal protective equipment. If you're using herbicides, you're going to be using sharp tools a lot of the time. You're going to be dealing with prickly invasives. Poison ivy is all over the place out there. It's not fun. If you get a bad exposure to it, you may decide you don't want to do this stuff anymore. That's not good. Don't pull vines that you cut from trees because they're liable to come down on you or pull a branch down on you. They're going to dry out. They're going to fall off on their own. And just watch where you're walking. Don't step into little holes that have yellow jacket nests in them. Okay. Anyhow, we need to wrap up. And thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
You're welcome.
I'm going to share my screen in just a second, but one thing I want to really quick, because I know we're at 2:00, 2:02, is I know it might have seemed confusing when we talk about who can apply herbicide on public lands, and we just want to make sure you know that the jurisdiction actually has to um, has to give you permission to do that, whether you are a certified applicator or not certified. So don't think you can go on any public land and apply herbicide. Each jurisdiction's got different rules, and you need to check with that first before you do that. Thank you so much, Tim. This is your best presentation yet. I learn something every time Tim teaches one of our classes, and remember, you know, we already went through the Q&A, but hopefully you got your questions answers. I was keeping an eye on the Q&A tab, and it looked like all of them were addressed. So hopefully that was the case. But if not, you can email us. Real quick, Tim's going to be back in December and doing our invasive control webinar again. And we're also going to have our invasive identification webinar. We're going to try to be doing these seasonally. So hopefully you can join us on December 3rd for identification and invasive control on December 4th. I'll be sending you more information about that when I send you our the recording of this and additional information. So if you probably noticed in the past, we actually charged $10 for these classes, and this is the first year we have not been charging, and we hope to increase access to everyone to provide this important information. But as you probably realized, doing these types of events is free to the public, but it's not free for Blue Ridge Prism. So if you feel so inclined, we would love if you could support our work by any type of donation. Anything would be really gratefully accepted. So if you keep that in mind, thank you for considering. Again, really quick, any more information you'd like, our fact sheets, more about PRISM, go to our website, blueridgeprism.org. Contact us if you've got additional questions, info@blueridgeprism.org. You can follow us on social media. We're pretty active on Facebook and Instagram. And again, if you'd like to volunteer for different tasks to help us out, email us at the same address. one more reminder that the recording of this webinar will be emailed to you in a few days. So sit tight. You can watch Tim again in all his glory in whatever time of day, and repeat this as many times so you can learn everything he had to teach. And that's it. Thanks so much for joining us. We're 5 minutes over, which I don't think is too bad. There's going to be a short survey that's going to come up right after this webinar. If you could fill it out, we'd appreciate it so we know what types of subjects we can do future programs on to better help you. We're grateful to you and to the Virginia Environmental Endowment for allowing us to come into your home or your offices to spread the word about invasive plants and for all your support for our outreach and education. Thanks so much, everyone. Hope you enjoy your weekend. I guess we can call it early weekend, right? Since it's Thursday. And thank you again, Tim. We all learned a lot.
Alrighty.